maybe one of the downsides to the good people that came into the administration trying to do the right thing, trying to steer Trump in the right direction, keep him legal and constitutional. One of the downsides to that was that the American public really didn't understand how dangerous he was. And I kind of came to this realization that I needed to say something. I didn't think many people would listen. Other people had tried to warn and hadn't made much of a dent in the MAGA movement, but it still felt like it was a burden, a call to explain to the American public what I had witnessed inside and why I felt like he was very dangerous. Not just from a national security standpoint, but that is definitely one of my biggest concerns. But he's dangerous to the social fabric for our country, and that's unfortunately a threat that still persists today.
It really does, doesn't it? I don't know if you or I could have imagined that 4 years later we would be dealing with this man as a candidate again. But I want to touch on a few of the things you mentioned. You mentioned, and I read about this in the introduction to your book, about you kind of being pushed out of the Trump administration and kind of being subjected to this loyalty test when Johnny McEntee, who I unfortunately know quite well too, was brought in to head presidential personnel in the waning months of Trump's administration. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so there was this moment where I was being pushed out of one role because Stephen Miller didn't like the way I'd handled trying to implement the constitutional version of the travel ban. And so I wasn't told I have to leave. I was just told you can't do this job anymore, which, given how other people had been treated over the previous 3 years, was kind of, the writing's on the wall. You're like, yeah, it's fine. I've done as much as I can. I've held the line where I can. It's time to get out. But then I was in this limbo where they were like, oh, you can't leave until you have this replacement filled in for you. And in the interim, I was trying to figure out a way just to gracefully exit, right? You're trying to figure out, how do I find the next job? And can I go over to CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency? And that's where Chris Krebs was. They were working on election security. I knew I could probably do some good over there working with Chris. And so I was actually in the process of doing that. The last day I was briefing out with my staff, transitioning a new person into the role. And Friday at 6 p.m., I get a phone call that says, sorry, you can't move over to CISA. And you're like, okay, well, what's going on? And we had found out that Johnny McEntee had put a halt on all personnel actions while he was trying to wrestle control back. I suppose from what he perceived to be a personnel process that was not sufficiently ensuring that the appointees were loyal to Trump. And the word kind of came down that everybody that was going to move to a new role had to go through an interview process again. And then subsequently, at that point, I didn't really want to stay, right? I'm like, that's okay, I'll just leave.
Of course.
Right. But there was this thing that I would say about 4 to 6 weeks after I left, I started hearing from colleagues who were being dragged in kind of unceremoniously, like they didn't know why they were being called to a meeting, and then they were having to go through an interview process. These were people that had started in 2017. They were significantly credentialed individuals, like they were highly qualified for the roles that they're playing. And so they're not being interviewed to test, like, are we really sure that you're qualified for this job? Okay. It was very much what questions were like, what is your favorite campaign slogan or campaign principle for Donald Trump? A few of the questions, like, borderline got to the question of, if you were asked to do something illegal, would you do it? It wasn't that blatant, but it was. After a while, you start to learn this crew. They operate like a mafia boss. They never come right out and say the illegal thing, but they get really close, and you're like, I think what you're asking me to do is illegal. And so you just, after a while you were like, oh my gosh, like they're doing this
Mhm.
before an election,
Yeah.
meaning one, they don't care if this gets out. And two, they actually think that they're going to win because what they were doing was setting up the second term, like weeding through who do I need to fire so that I can have sufficiently loyal people in the second term. And this week there was news reports that they're doing loyalty tests over at the RNC, and you're like, oh yeah, that's just how they do it. It does not matter if you're credentialed, it doesn't matter if you're skilled at your job. What matters is that you will do anything to serve Trump, including illegal things, including unconstitutional things. And I don't know. I appreciate that there are probably some people in his supporters who actually love that part about him. They probably love that he is doesn't care about following the rules. I feel like the average Republican, though, doesn't know this part of the story, that they think it's all made up, or they think, it's just the liberal deep state that's like hyperbolizing things. And you're like, no, like many of us went in and just assumed, like, oh, it can't be that bad. I'm from Texas. I wasn't from New York. I didn't appreciate the mafia nature of how they operate. But even, I mean, your story, Jessica, gives like the perfect examples of how they were coming after you viciously,
Yeah.
right? Like totally out of alignment or out of parity for the
What I have
circumstances.
said. Exactly.
But that's
Yes.
what they do. It's like they come at you with full force.
Yes.
They threaten. When I spoke out,
Yes.
we received threats. Friends that had access to me were threatened,
Mm.
hoping that by threatening them, they could get me to be quiet. I mean, that's how they operate. They operate stealthily. It's under the radar, but it is a mafia. It is authoritarian, and there's no place for that in our government. Like that is not what we want in this country.
Yeah. You're kind of leaving me speechless here a little bit, Elizabeth, because as you're talking, I'm remembering the experience I had. We also, I told you I was trying to get through your book, which was wonderful, by the way. In conjunction with this week, we filed in my human rights lawsuit, which is still ongoing, the one that was thwarted for years by their NDA retaliation. They're trying to silence me. And we just filed literally today our case essentially for the sex discrimination and all of these heinous attacks that were leveled against me by a man who, like Johnny McEntee, was brought in at the 11th hour because he was a loyalist and willing to do anything for Trump. It really is so frightening. And like you said, Elizabeth, I don't think that most Republicans, mainstream Republicans, to the extent that mainstream exists in the Republican Party, or diehard Trump supporters, understand that a time is going to come when this formula will turn on them. It's not
Yes.
going to turn on the liberals. It's not going to turn on the, quote unquote Hollywood elite or whatever these fantasy, scary, evil forces are out there. It's going to turn on them.
It's so true. He doesn't care about them, right? Like he cares about himself.